Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right. Great. Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate the welcome, and I think it's quite fitting, right? Like National Indigenous History Month, uh, National Indigenous Peoples Day. I didn't even think about that when I was talking to Alana, but it makes total sense, and I'm excited to be here with you guys. Um, in starting the project and thinking about it or the talk, um, I didn't even think about when I was naming it, but I landed on this indigenous typography, and it's been something I've been thinking about recently as I'm doing research, as I'm also like designing, and I'm also teaching, and so I've been having a lot of insights lately, and so I think in terms of what we're going to cover in this space in indigenous typography, I'm really looking at a lot of theoretical, philosophical kind of elements, and how I'm trying to navigate that myself as a design practitioner. So we can jump through it and cover that together. Um, so I am an enrolled member of the Hickory Apache Nation based in Dulce, New Mexico, which is northern New Mexico in the Southwest. I currently hold the role of assistant professor of communication design, but I also teach in foundations there. So I also double in interaction design and industrial design, which we'll kind of jump into that with some of the student work. I received my certificate in type design from the Letterform Archive, and then I also hold an MFA in visual communication design and a bachelor's in graphic design. Um, and yeah, I usually start off my all of these talks with this kind of like standard performance of land acknowledgements and such. And so I'm not going to go through that, but I do want to just take a minute so you guys can read through this, and maybe there's something that we'll pull from there that has like meaning for us. A lot of the discussion about land acknowledgements recently is really about the education for you guys, and so I feel like all of these things are really intertwined and interconnected or underlying in the work that I do. Um, but that's how it's supposed to be, right? And I think the educational part is I'm trying to disseminate these ideas so that all of you can kind of engage with that yourself, right? What is our own relationships with indigenous lands and indigenous communities, and how do we look and think about indigenous typographies, or even those like values or perspectives or principles that underlie those. So um, this is something that I've been working on, and we'll even look at another one later. So it's standard MST, right? And I'm still always getting torn and updating this. So I added Stalo, and then I added Swasin and Ketsi and Kwantlen and Semyama, right, where I live. And so I think the longer I live here, the more I know, and then I have a greater appreciation for where I'm at right now, right? And so I'm hoping that you guys also can see the value of living in this place. I'm originally from New Mexico, but we're not doing this necessarily in New Mexico, or we're not doing this as well as we are doing this in Chicago, where I just came before BC. So um, I think you have to know that to really appreciate that. And yeah, this is also a big prompt for some of the design work that I do with students. So because students have to also navigate that space themselves, right? Like if you work for or do design work in this region, this is kind of standardized, right? So you have to know, how do I make those little accents, and how do I upturn the E, or all those little thingies, right? What are they even named? So it's a great place to learn. And so I hope we can jump into that. The other thing with this is kind of like um, setting the context, right, for how we understand it. Through these like letter forms, uh, we're looking at the perpetuation of like colonization, right? Like if anybody speaks a different languages or doesn't like work within the Latin script, right? We're not really supporting you in that way. And so we have to also acknowledge colonization in here. And this particularly is linguistic imperialism, right? So this is the dominance of this Latin script. So we can look at that, or the imposition of that. We can also look at the neocolonialism of language, right, as it applies to this typographic space, and why are they so standard, in their systems, right, and not so much expressive. But yeah, this is a great jumping off point for that educational dive. I also wanted to just start off this in kind of managing expectations, where in this like typographic space, there's a lot of discussions, and my partner at Typotech, Kevin King, he's actually doing a really great job at looking at this very nuanced work in terms of how we can do that in terms of type design and working with communities, and working on platform issues and encoding and software and keyboards and typographic preferences. We can, I'm happy to recommend those to you, but that's not necessarily going to be in this talk. And so I apologize for that. But I think it's still great to have an idea and to be able to conceptualize how we think about that before we even get into that kind of nuanced work. When I was starting to teach, I was really the only Indigenous student in that space, and I didn't know of any other Indigenous professors that I could even talk to as a precedence, right, for the work that I'm doing. And so I really found inspiration with Felix Gonzalez Torres. I don't know if anybody of you are familiar with this artist, but I encourage you to dive into their work and to kind of see what is there to pick up from it. And there's so much that you can pick up. And one of the things that because he was also an educator, and he was a BIPOC individual, and he was queer, and he was the only brown person working in this academic institution. And so I understood that in how I was also kind of doing similar things. And so I took a lot of inspiration as an educator, but I also took a lot of inspiration in how I'm approaching that space as a critical thinker. And so in terms of typography, I'm also trying to think about, well, how do I do that in this space? And so a lot of the theoretical things have to kind of precede the work that comes after that. So that's why I think this is really valuable of a talk. When we're looking at typefaces, we're looking at two different perspectives. So the first one is the visual perspectives, which we all see, right? We saw Helvetica Neue, and now we're looking at, Menlo. And so we're always in touch with that visual perception or representation. What we're not so familiar about when we look at them is that they have these ties to history, right, and historical contexts. So as we're thinking about these as students, we're not just looking at the visual representation, right, the identity of it, but this like unpacking the history of it. Like, who even designed this? Like, was it a man, or was it a woman? Was he white, or was he, a BIPOC individual? What languages does he speak? What foundry released it? All of those things I really think are elemental to how we attach those and utilize typefaces in our design work. So when we start to think about typefaces, we need to really think about all of these different elements that actually are part of that package. And then we must also acknowledge that, we acknowledged linguistic imperialism, but in terms of typography, right? Typography and language are not neutral, right? They're used in certain purposes and instances, and like I said, they're a perpetuation of colonization, right? And so we must acknowledge that before we can even start working with it and understanding it. As I was looking back and trying to find like content for students, I'm really trying to define again, like, well, what is typography to myself? and what can I kind of like pass on to students. So um, for some reason, I got drawn back to the works of Robert Bringhurst and the elements of typographic style, where he states that typography is a craft of endowing human language with a durable visual form and thus with an independent existence. And so I think about these things and how do they apply to me, right? What does durable even mean in this context? And then also, the independent existence is something that I think is really, fitting, right? And as a, in an indigenous context, we could also mention like sovereignty, right? And independence as being very similar. I came from a family, this is my grandmother. I came from a family that really nurtured traditional cultural practices. Here you can see her with, some of her basketry, which we did in sumac and willow, and then also micaceous pottery on the far end of that. Part of, this exploration and growing up in this space, you can't help but develop a sensitivity to the material or materiality, right? We could also call that material culture, and then the visual aspects, like the designs here on this basket, that falls under, and is can be classified as visual culture as well. And working with those in indigenous spaces, you have to be kind of very careful in how you approach those, right? Because certain things have certain meanings, and we don't want to misuse those or disrespect those. But there are modes of communication, there is meaning, and there's values embedded in these practices. And so those are things that I really appreciated and I think helped me get to where I'm at right now. But going back to that idea of durability, right? We might not think of these, items of cultural patrimony as in the sense that we think of typography, right? But in a way where there's kind of that common ground where they're vessels for culture. So along with the visual and the material places, we also must acknowledge the history, right? So within New Mexico and a lot of other places across North America, we've had to fall into colonization and reservations in the States, reserves up in Canada, which actually contrasts, if we look at the farther one, that's actually a map of our original, home base or homelands. And now we actually occupy this one at the top and central of New Mexico. So, yeah, part of what we're looking at. I think when I'm also looking back at this work, I'm also looking at conversations that parallel this space. So Sadie Redwing, I don't know if anybody of you guys are familiar, but I encourage you to look up her work. She's really elemental in being able to understand how we work with visual culture in indigenous communities and how it applies to contemporary design. And so Sadie Redwing is a big advocate for tribal visual sovereignty. And this idea of visual sovereignty is something that I want you to think about. For her and her research, this was primarily investigating the image part of that ratio. So we were looking at, the semiotics of what those values and the meanings that were embedded in those graphics, and how do we use them? How do we utilize them in terms of our visual language from our indigenous community? I feel that I'm kind of in relation to that, where I was actually looking at not only the visual culture, but the material culture, and really looking at typography as well. And how do we represent indigenous peoples in terms of typography? So some of these early explorations that I was looking at, I was putting together these ideas and I was designing things and I was trying to think about, concepts, and I was thinking about representation. I was also thinking about technology, and then intention too as well. So I think a lot of this investigation and trying to figure out what it even means is really helpful for me in that growth. So So Bringhurst also states that every alphabet is a culture, or maybe he's saying, or I'm saying, that every alphabet should reflect that culture, right? So when we're thinking back on how typographies apply to indigenous communities, um, it should be a reflection of that. I didn't include a slide on this, but I think the works of Juliet Shen and the Lushootseed tribe just south of the border really one of the things that I even showed in my classes and expose them to as a great example of how that can work. But what we looking at today and part of the inspiration for the talk was that right now we're looking at these kind of like universal design typefaces, right? So this like everything can do type of approach to typeface, like the Noto family, right? Usable by all people to the greatest possible extent without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And this is great, but I think this is part of that discussion that I'm trying to get to. And then also, if I'm going back to Felix Gonzalez Torres, right, I'm questioning this as well, right? Like, is this the way to go? Or, is specialized design a way out of this, right? Is there only one way of doing this? And do I really find value in looking at these character sets or research that I'm developing typefaces, but all I'm doing is adding these digital armatures and not really working with communities. So I think that's one of the perspectives that I look at when I'm seeing these come into play. And BC has its own offshoot of this, right? So there's also an offshoot approach of BC Sans is an offshoot of Noto, something that they developed and of course and updated in 23. And then we also have the new Microsoft Systems fonts, which we also helped with our team at Typotech to do a lot of testing for this. But again, like, I go back to community usage. I go back to indigenous designers, indigenous type designers. Is this what we're here for, right? Is this my calling? Is just to do this? Because I'm also in that space, right, as a type designer. And adding to that, right, we have these independent research initiatives, right? And how do we also work with communities, and how are we positioning this in terms of governments or institutions, associations, businesses, nonprofits, designers? All of those things can be thought about as we go through this exercise. And I'm not saying that they're bad, because even as Bringhar says, that typography thrives as a shared concern, right? We're really talking about community, and there are no paths to all where there are no shared desires or directions. So I think that's great, and there's usage for that. And maybe I fall closer to Chris Skillern's approach, who is an amazing Cherokee type designer who's really into display types, right? And if you haven't seen his work, I encourage you to look at that work, his work as well. As far as where I'm coming from, I think I'm gaining increasing interest in these perspectives, or this kind of like oasis of indigenous typographic wilderness, right? And what does that look like? But because I'm working in my own bubble, right, and I have a small group of friends who also do this, it's me looking at my work and navigating that, but also looking at their work as well, and reflecting to establish my own principles and practices and ethics that support the survival of indigenous languages. When I was getting into this work, and the visual culture stuff, it was really just like practicing, right, and getting into a place. I think I feel like I really started in the visual culture space, and being able to do things like these that really spoke to where I was coming from as an Hickory Apache creative. I also think that narratives and how I navigated that, and how they were embedded in certain materials and certain kind of processes or certain representations or projections, I think were really meaningful. I also think in working with archives, I also found like relatives and found people and found connections, even though I was, in working in Chicago, I was a ways from my whole family and my tribe. So finding those relatives were something that was reinforcing for my practice. And then I also think having that patience to uh, be intentional, right, and how we approach things. Um, you know, I think as we navigate spaces, we don't really know always what we're doing. Like I think when I was creating this, I was just like, well, I'm just going to do it, and maybe it'll make sense afterwards. But it actually led to more work, and through this like development, you coincidentally kind of define your voice, right, and how you want to or how you can practice in this work. I also think that the combination of putting these different ideas together, combining different elements of the material culture and these kind of typographic vessels and exhibition spaces, they just lead further into exploring different contexts and really developing that body of work and being able to, work in different capacities. The commonality in all of this, as I would look closer into typography, was really about representation, right? Like I think in terms of the indigenous spaces, I wasn't the only one dealing with it, right? Part of the curriculum that we share at Emily Carr is working and looking at case studies. So like chop suey fonts, right, from Eastern Asian communities can be similar things, or we can look at different applications of, ethnicities and how they are actually characterized typographically. And so I think those things are really vital and were really vital in terms of how I think about and how I work through like representation typographically. I think that also through that process is just the continuation of explorations, right? Uh, Seeing common practices and also just sharing and developing what was in my head and sharing that. So things like these waterfalls or logo types or dictionaries or rugs or plays on words, right? Wordplay. I think those were some things that like helped me keep along in the work. And I think some of them were successful in just being able to manifest and kick out that idea. And then some of them actually maybe held a little bit more meaning and maybe a little bit more cheeky or a little bit more directed at certain forces or entities. But through that work, I was able to enter into type design, and I think I was really fortunate. This is actually the first. This is a mock-up, but this is the first kind of like foray into that. And what I was really doing was looking at, my own orthography for my tribe. And the problem is there was just so much characters, and so trying to even understand from a typographic, or I guess a typographic style approach, right? We don't talk about typographic style enough, but what is that, right? And how do I even navigate my own typographic style? But this was, one of the first ones, and the kind of like light bulb effect was really just trying to hack that system, where in this first one, I'm actually looking at 51 characters in this. And I was just thinking to myself, well, how do we just like combine them so it makes it an easier, like less set of characters to work with, and being able to kind of like think of and kind of like understand, well, maybe if I make these kind of like investigations or insightful like changes into them, maybe I can actually make it into something where it makes sense. But in this space, I think this is the most influential work for me because it just makes us think about the culture, but also that language and typography isn't a fixed thing, right? Like if I wanted to do this, or I wanted to go from here, or my community wanted to do this, I can do this, right? And so that's part of these kind of like ideas of sovereignty, but also ideas of self-determination in indigenous communities where we actually control this space. And I think that goes back to the title of the talk, where I think for people, especially indigenous people, they need to know that we control this space. And even though you can make all these, these global, multi-script typefaces, if I want to change it, I can change it, right? And I have that power. And I think that that's going to be a big game changer in terms of how we think about indigenous languages and indigenous typography going forward. Because as we're finding out through the research, a lot of communities don't have like fixed orthographies, or they have multiple orthographies, or we have regional, or we have band or clan preferences that actually contradict what we actually see. And so it goes back even further as we're thinking into the encoding, right, and Unicode. Maybe that system is something that needs to be built to support this, right? Or maybe platforms and software should also be something that supports that. Not necessarily something that falls on us, but it falls on them, right? As people who offer these services. After that, I actually went really deep into type design. The first idea that I have, because it was just like an immersive type of idea where if I change the language around me, and I was actually thinking of my home town of Dulce, New Mexico. So if I changed all of the signage in the town, would that encourage people to learn the language just because of that indirect exposure? And we're no longer seeing, right, like the Latin, alphabet in use. Even though we do use that. I think there's something about being able to experiment and push into that space and to see what's even possible, right? And I think that in some instances, like we can actually learn the language, even though the typeface, like Luis said, like there might be problems with the kerning, right? We might have problems with the floating accents or whatever, but the concept, right, and how we approach that is really what's like important, right? And we might not be good at it now, but as we go forward, we're just going to get better, and things are going to get better. After taking that course, which the first one, which is titled Danaza, which means our language in Hickorea, I took this and developed this as a Type at Cooper workshop, and so I really appreciated that. And if it wasn't for like scholarships for Indigenous students and BIPOC individuals, I wouldn't have even had the chance to take that course. And the same thing goes for my stint at Type West at the Letterform Archive. I'm just an educator, and I don't make a lot of money, and so I think we also have to think about systematically how equity works and how we need to support people who maybe don't make as much money, and who people have big ideas, and we need to support them in that. But this is the first project that I did from Type West. It's entitled Beshi. It's a revival of Uldrich Menhart's typeface Parliament. And so I really appreciated this work. And, it's a text typeface. So once you get into those like sizes that are very small, it's a lot of like pixel pushing, and this still needs a lot of like work kerning. But I think in terms of like the revival of it, I think it's very successful. I do want to publish this, or I had wanted to publish this, but because of copyright issues, it's not necessarily available right now. But Beshi in Hickorea means the knife. I thought it was really fitting because of the very calligraphic and sharp style and approach to the letter form designs. Things like this, where I was actually working through, going through the dictionary and also doing like oral history research, really lends to laying out text type in that way. And then also the dictionary that I mentioned, my grandmother she has also played a impactful part in that. So I think this mock-up was something where I was like, something that was fitting to dedicate to her and her work. The final project that I kicked out from Type West is Goni, and so this is a current work in progress typeface. There's a not only the regular, the italic, and the bold, but there's also a stencil typeface. I think some of the things that I was actually interested in going through the whole process is that I really like stencil typefaces, and if we look at today's like lettering or numeral design, I think these ideas of like protest are really interesting and meaningful in the current climate, right? And how that's something that if we're going to need typefaces and use typefaces, that's going to be one of the most valuable things. This is part of the type specimen that got printed with that cohort through Type West. The other things that I find outside of that space is just like keeping a sketchbook. So I work with Squamish and I collaborate with them, and so things like these are really interesting and fun to me. I also have this typeface that's in development called it's Aija. It's a typeface I developed in a week in February, and I think it's really interesting. And then I also do different things like these because my tribe has 2 clans, and so I think these ideas of having 2 different elements in a typeface, or these stencil kind of like opportunities, I think those are kind of like common threads in the typefaces, where they have to be represented one way on a certain background, and then it also has to be reflected in the other way. So I think those are successful in being able to work. I also think a lot about representation and stereotypes in terms of typefaces. And so this is a typeface that I designed called Anu, or you can also pronounce it Anoya, depending on how you prefer. But I think when I'm teaching type design and we're talking about stereotypes, we also have to talk about the generalization, right? And how we're fitting that to Indigenous communities as well. So this is actually just an educational typeface. I'm not planning on like selling it, but different compositions and things like these are really fun for me. And we had the discussion earlier about readability and legibility, and I think that they're both valid. But I think if you want to read it, you can. It says, I am condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. And so I think that was really fitting in terms of typography and where I'm coming from, and being able to kind of like lay out stuff like that, where I think it's beautiful and visually compelling, but also the meaning is there as well. While I do all of that, I also teach. And so the land acknowledgement becomes a standard thing in the curriculum. If any students from Emily Carr have taken classes from me, they know that. This is something that's also kind of like a conversation starter, part of our prompts in terms of type design. But yeah, in coming to Emily Carr, I was thrusted into this kind of like research space. And so we was working with a number of different entities, and we actually got paired with an alternative school on the north side of Vancouver called Kenneth Gordon Maplewood School, or KGMS. And so as I came into Vancouver, I was able to take on all of this research, and I think they thought I was the best fit to kind of lead it forward. So I was working with Zach Kamosi, who did a lot of this initial work. And you can see kind of some of the work that we spanned across. And he led it and handed it off to me. And yeah, it was a really interesting kind of partnership for a while. This is part of the foundation program. So in the spring of the first year of students at Emily Carr, they actually have to go through the foundation program before they can get into communication design. But within that curriculum, we had 3 projects that were split into there. So we start off in communication design and go into interaction design and then industrial design, where we first start in 2D visual design and then go into digital interactions and then move on to analog interactions. And the analog interactions are actually supported by the shops and the studios at Emily Carr. So depending on where students' interests lie, the only real necessary element in this is that the students have to integrate the Squamish language in some form into that project. So it can become manifested as, visual puzzles like these, or conceptual designs like this, where we were able to integrate the little spindle with the language at the bottom. Workshops like these, where students would go out into the wild and see animals in rocks, and they could, create a box, but also be able to kind of identify what that word is, right, and be able to practice through that way. And then we had a whole range of puzzles, which this one is actually gauged on color, learning colors. Some of the most unique ones here is the mobiles, right? So fixed mobiles. We had students working in the digital fabrication lab and then printing them. These were actually magnetic refrigerator puzzles. And then one of the most successful was actually textile developed dice. So that's we had one that was category was animals, and then we had another complementary one that was based on insects. And this one was actually a rotating puzzle. And the nice thing is that it was nested in each other. So if you put it above, if you tipped it over, it wouldn't actually fall apart, but it was nested within each other. And they were able to align the specific colors and the animals, and you could learn by aligning to either of those. We also had stacking games that were actually 3D printed. And then we also had things like this, where these cookies were made and a digital interface with audio and chips and batteries were integrated so that you can actually hear the language as you press those buttons under the chips. It was really, really advanced for a first-year design student. And all of this got actually worked and disseminated, and teachers could check these out at KGMS. And so it was a really, we called this our exhibit. So, they could take from that, and it was really great. Part of the work is that, I always invite someone in to collaborate in the work. So this is Aaron Nelson Moody, or Splash. He came in this past year to actually do silversmithing works with my course. And they were able to create arrowheads. And we could talk about the symbolism of the arrowhead and how that applied to the work that we're going to do as we continue on in our studies. The other class that I teach is actually a type design class. So, I wasn't going to talk about like character sets and those kind of things, but through that class, we actually engage with that. So, this is some of the work. There's 2 actual projects within this course. So it's a 3-credit course, upper level course. And then the first project is actually based on land acknowledgements. So for this one, Anahi, she wanted to letter and design Squamish because of her relationship with that land. And then the other typeface, which is later on and comes in the later half of the term, is actually her own like independently driven typeface. So there's going to be a range for each student, but you can look at those as we go through these next few slides. So Chase, the one on the right, actually animated, and so you could pull it through an app, and it'll actually spin and go through those things. We have Rowan, who actually did this one based on the Musqueam First Nation. Mantis chose to do this on Tsleil-Waututh. Gabrielle had their own iterations. The other thing that I wanted to mention too is that these were all funded by an indigenization and decolonization fund, so that all of the iterations that students developed were then able to get Rizzo printed, and then we could also share those prints with the students. So I think in total we had 20 produced, and so that meant that every student could keep one or keep, let's see, 5 of them, and then the other 15 to 18 would actually could get shared out with other students. So by the end of the course, you could have your own kind of like type specimens, but you could also have this whole collection from the course from other students and what they were able to actually develop during the course. So it was a great thing to bring together in terms of a community, giving back, but also creating community within the program. I feel that, typography is a great space for students. And then this also very localized approach to type design is very useful for design students as they enter into the lower mainland region. And then again, we also partnered with Monique Ortman that year, who's a Cherokee designer, and she was able to produce her own design for the project, which we printed and gave out to students as well. So I want to kind of wrap up and leave the talk with these ideas of typographic reconciliation. And I think, like I mentioned, there's a lot of different levels in how this applies to you, right? How does this apply to government? How does this apply to type foundries? How does this apply to type designers, designers in general? I want us to think about 4 different elements. So we mentioned sovereignty, and what does that mean? And how do I reconcile personally in terms of understanding sovereignty? The second one is self-determination. So, how do I offer, or how do I understand how communities can make their own choices and pursue their own projects? In terms of the educational and other organizations and institutions, the other ones I want you to think about is indigenization, right? And that's always in relation to this decolonization and colonization. So everyone is going to be different, but I think when we get to that space, when we can start thinking about how reconciliation applies to ourselves, this space will only grow and will only get better at being designers and people and community members. So I don't think that it's kind of an open-ended thing, but theoretically, this is where I'm at, and I wanted to share that with you guys. And I wanted to share this last slide. So the typeface, the lettering piece that we did today, it was actually just a little sketch in my sketchbook before it actually came this. So I think it's great. It's part of that sketchbook practice where we always have those things that we can pull from. And generally, the idea for this is that I'm just generally thankful, and part of this journey is me going back and giving back to the community and being thankful for everyone. And so I hope you guys can share that with your communities and your loved ones and your peoples, right? And so thank you. Thanks so much, Leo. Oh.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we're really grateful to have you here today as well. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing the print. It's been fantastic to have your talk. So, yes, here, I'll give you this one back. And if we have a couple of questions, we'll take those before we.
Hi.
Oh, perfect. Before we wrap up. If you're maybe an educator yourself and you have questions for Leo or questions about his process,
Hey, thank you. I really appreciated the talk. Not so much a question, just something I was hoping you could talk a bit more about. You mentioned how like the language doesn't always have to be like an alphabet or something like that. You were showing that the cultural symbols through the weavings and that sort of thing. How do you find that written language, when it's maybe not always so like it isn't always how the culture developed with writing things down in kind of an alphabet. How does that kind of influence creating alphabets or typographies for cultures where that may not have been the kind of the historical norm?
So a lot of, indigenous communities don't have like written languages.
Mhm.
So I think, when I directed the work of Juliet Shen, what she's really looking at in the development of the aesthetic character of that typeface, she was really looking at visual and material culture that she was pulling from museums. And so there was nuanced like forms that she was pulling from those objects of cultural patrimony to actually influence and kind of lead the aesthetic development of that. So typography is really subtle. So, if we're looking at any of the text typefaces that we're using, these very subtle marks that get integrated into the system, it can really change depending on how you apply them. And so I think um, it is really open-ended, right? And we have a whole diversity of indigenous cultures across the continent. And so I think it's exciting for communities to think that of like, if they do want to invest in an orthography, where do they draw inspiration from? And how do we investigate our own identities as indigenous people to kind of lead that way, right? And connecting with culture or reconnecting with culture or finding, like I said, finding in archives those relatives that might have been taken through colonization.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have one more? I really enjoyed also how you spoke to the piece about Noto and sort of that like sameness of things. And really enjoying the stencil font you did as well. Is there like anything else that you're excited about or enthusiastic about, where you talked about display type as an opportunity maybe to explore some of that thing, kind of just bouncing off the last question?
Yeah, I think for everyone, like I I think it's great as an educator to see when students express themselves. Like I think that expression is really what is exciting. Anyone can do like a sans serif, right? And that's anyone can do these like kind of like character sets and codings and stuff like that. To truly express yourself is really where it's at. So everyone is unique in their identity and where they're coming from. I think for me and my students, that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in what, like, how are you expressing yourself? Where's the fun in all of that? And it can lead anywhere. It can lead anywhere conceptually, aesthetically. We can have its own like inspirations. And like you saw some of the work, I mean, some of the students were actually taking from visual culture, but some students were actually going total opposite ways that are unexpected. And I think that's really great, because we don't necessarily need universal design right now. I think we need more specialization. We need more characterization and expression.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you very much, Leo, for the presentation and for widening our perspective on this.
Thank you, everyone.